It's the biggest far-right victory since World War II. But what does it really mean for Germany? Though unlikely to form a government, the AfD's historic win in the state of Thuringin shows the far right is a political force to be reckoned with. But what's driving Germans to vote for the extremes that brought them so much trauma in the past? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Germany. Both fascism and communism wreaked havoc on Germany over the course of the 20th century. The Nazis' loss in World War II ushered Stalinism into East Germany, which eventually led to the complete separation of democratic West Germany from the communist-controlled East. Now, when the two were reunited in 1989, the scenes of East Germans crawling over and through a wall that they would have been shot for approaching just days before made the entire world emotional. So why are so many East Germans voting again for the political extremes that once divided the country? Here's a look now at the weekend's complex state elections in East Germany.
Germany's far right is celebrating its first regional election victory of the post-World War II era. Alternative for Germany won nearly 33% of the vote in the eastern state of Thuringia on Sunday. That's more than a 10-point lead over its closest competitor, the Christian Democratic Union. The AfD has also made gains in neighboring Saxony, trailing the CDU by a razor-thin margin.
We see the turmoil here in Germany and in Thuringia. How many people have turned their backs on democracy? Our mission is to solve the challenges and problems that people have been articulating for years in the areas of migration and energy policy.
The AfD's election strategy focused on the frustration many Germans feel over migration, green energy policy, and funding for Ukraine. The party's leader in Thuringia says he's now ready to accept his mandate to govern.
As the strongest party, we will of course invite others to talks, but only after the party committees meet next week and analyze the situation in detail.
Björn Höcke is a former history teacher who has been twice convicted of using Nazi slogans. He is also one of the AfD's most senior leaders at the national level. His political opponents in Thuringia want to stop him from taking power. They aim to form a coalition to prevent him from forming a government. For many Germans, the rise of Höcke and his AfD party has become a major source of anxiety. The country's domestic intelligence chief once described Höcke as his top concern among Germany's right-wing extremists. The Domestic Intelligence Agency was established after World War II to protect the German constitution against extremism. For years, it has warned of the threat far-right groups like the AfD pose to German democracy. It listed the AfD as a suspected right-wing extremist party in 2021, a label the party has challenged in court but been unable to remove. The elections in Thuringia and Saxony show how far East Germany has shifted to the right. The three parties that make up the country's federal government all suffered major defeats. The Liberals are now out of both state parliaments, the Greens out of one, and the Social Democrats barely got into both. The next state election will happen in the eastern state of Brandenburg in 3 weeks' time. The latest polls show AfD leading. Berlin will be watching closely. The state polls have become an ominous sign for Germany's coalition government, led by Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Federal elections are just 1 year away. Scholz has been trying to act quickly to diffuse public anger since a stabbing attack killed 3 people in the western city of Solingen. It happened a week before the state elections in Saxony and Thuringia, amplifying public anger over his government's migration policy. The alleged attacker is a Syrian migrant who was seeking asylum. His application had been rejected, but he was never deported.
Obviously, we will now have to tighten up the legal regulations on weapons that we in Germany have. This applies in particular to the use of knives, but also to many other things that need to be regulated.
Scholz's government has accelerated migrant deportations following the attack and is taking steps to tighten its migration policy. With his coalition on the defensive and appearing more fragile than ever, the AfD is pushing hard for more gains nationwide. In the process, the AfD's anti-immigrant rhetoric is polarizing the nation. For some, it triggers memories of the country's Nazi past. For others, it fuels a new kind of nationalism. that could soon shake German democracy to its core.
So what is motivating certain regions of Germany to move so far to the right? And is it a reflection of what's to come in next year's federal elections? Well, joining me now to discuss that are all from Berlin, Alternative for Germany politician and member of the Bundestag, Frank Hansel, coordinator at the SETA Foundation in Berlin, Zafer Mese, and journalist and political analyst, James Jackson. Thanks all so much for being with me. James, I'll start with you because I want to get a better understanding of the dynamics of Thuringin in particular, and ask what you really think has drawn, especially East German voters, to a political ideology, or even an extreme, as some would describe it, that actually caused them a particular amount of trauma in the past.
Well, I think we should also point out that it didn't just cause Germans trauma. The National Socialist regime committed the Holocaust against Jews. It created a World War II. So just to get that out of the way, I think Thuringia has always been a bit of a special case in German politics, going right back to the 1930s, actually, because Thuringia was, of course, the first state where the National Socialist, the Nazi Party, won in 1933. But in recent years, it's interestingly been led by a left-wing party called the Left, which is sort of technically the continuation of the Socialist Unity Party, which ruled East Germany during the dictatorship, the East German dictatorship. So what we can see is that Thuringia has arguably always been a bit of a hotspot for extremism on the left and right. Now, I'm not always a fan of this far left, far right horseshoe theory, as it's called, but I think it is actually true in Thuringia. And what we've seen more than just the rise of the far right is the collapse of the governing left party, whose state premier Bodo Ramelow was actually very popular and kept winning in polls, but who would be the preferred minister-president, first minister of the state. I've interviewed Mr. Ramelow. He's very clear that he sees the AfD as a fascist party and his job in stopping fascism. He said that after the election too. But people vote for the party and not the leader. And in this case, the AfD has done very well with one of its most extreme leaders across Germany, Björn Höcke, who is quite notorious in the country for being convicted for using Nazi-era slogans, as well as describing the Holocaust Memorial as a monument of shame or disgrace. So a very controversial figure who's increasingly prominent in the AfD. I've written a profile of him in the Telegraph today, and you'll find that his voice will only become louder in Germany.
Okay. Well, let me ask Frank if that's a fair analysis, and because it is to say that the AfD could really only win by this margin in a state that is, effectively a hotspot for extremism, as James was describing it.
Well, I don't think so. Let's see the history of Thuringia. Thuringia is the heartland of the social democracy, which was founded there 150 years ago in Eisenach. So this is the basics. It has been a social democratic tradition for a long time. What we see with AfD generally is that we are considering ourselves, and also science accepts to see this, we are filling the lack of representation of the center right. We are a normal party, as you have it in Spain with Vox, the right-wing party Vox. You have Rassemblement National. It's a European phenomenon because Christian democracy in all those countries has been dismantled ideologically, and there was somebody who had to need this representation lack. That's what we basically are. And going to Thuringia, it's not that special because in Saxony we have almost the same results. It's really more about East and Western different socialization due to the dictatorship, as James said. In the East, this is a big problem. And also we have to see we are in a global discussion about East and West, about globalization and the problem of the Ukraine war and Russia. And there we have to see that in the eastern part of Germany, the attitude towards Russia and to the United States is completely different to what we have in the West. So this you may not neglect in this election. And there's also to remark to Björn Höcke, actually the party is voted Björn Höcke always has less sympathy voting as the party itself. In the last poll, it was 30% for the party and just 16 for him. So it's not the person, it's not the diabolization of him that's the phenomenon, but the AfD, which is actually today in Germany the representation of the center right, like in other European countries as well. That's my statement towards this.
Okay, let me ask Zafer then quickly, why, is it that way in particular toward Russia and Ukraine? Why is the attitude so different really in the East? Because you would think that they would have had just as much of a traumatic experience triggering, remembering, having to live under the GDR, not being able to see their family and their counterparts in West Germany, being restricted to travel, everything that went along with the rather traumatic division of Germany that they suffered for decades.
Well, it's true. The GDR is part of the explanation, but I think still now we are not debating in Germany how is the sociology and culture in Eastern Germany, because when the Berlin Wall fell on 9 November 89, it marked the beginning of the end of East German lifestyle. Everything that had shaped the cultural history was thought away, spoken away, and written away. West Germans took sovereignty over the narrative, and the verdict was clear. The former East Germany state was wrong and in every aspect and worth nothing. So it means not only the state, but in some parts they also include the citizens in Eastern Germany, because I'm very often there and I see that there is a huge anger about how the reunification was organized. Right after the unification until now, do you believe that? Some people do not believe 85% of all property belongs to the Western citizens, in Eastern Germany. So the culture is important, the sociology. They were not educated in transatlantic relations. They had no touch to Western countries, and they had the brotherhood, so-called, with Russia, with the Eastern countries, societies. There was a huge cultural exchange. That's why. This is the part that I would just try to.
James, I think you're shaking your head, so I have to ask you if you disagree there. Are East Germans somehow nostalgic for that time? And that the AfD kind of represents going back to what they had before in a better sense of security?
I think it's absolutely true that many East Germans are nostalgic, or there's even a wonderful German word for it, Ostalgie, which is nostalgia for the East, the Ost. But I do think this idea of brotherhood with Russia was actually never very popular in the East, except outside of the Socialist Unity Party's cadres and functionaries. Of course, Russia was deeply unpopular. Russia was seen as the occupier, and people protested, went out onto the streets and said, "Wir sind das Volk, we are the people," to try and get the Russians out and achieve German unity. They achieved it. This was actually one of the most successful peaceful movements in German history for democracy. Now, it's true that many have not been happy with reunification, but I think we shouldn't forget the element of immigration and, dare I say it, racism or nativism, as it's more often called in sociology. Eastern Germany was a very monocultural place, and it still has much less migration than in the West, but they are very unhappy about the migration that is there, as well as refugees who are, of course, being sent to the East as well as to the West.
Right. And East Germany went to lengths to maintain that monoculture now. And it almost seems to have made a much easier kind of target to use migrants now as a scapegoat for somewhat difficult economic times and personal frustration among East Germans. Is that what you're seeing, James?
I think so, because what was the real cause of these difficult economic times? It was, of course, Russia. Its invasion of Ukraine, full scale, 2 years ago, caused a huge energy crisis, which had a knock-on effect of the highest inflation that Germany has seen since World War II, according to Isabella Weber. Now, this means that people have less money in their pockets. And I do think it's fair to say that the far right, as well as the left-wing BSW party, have exploited this by talking about migrants and energy and Russia and peace with Russia. But I don't think there will be peace with Russia on the European continent anytime soon, while they're still occupying a large portion of Ukraine. The AfD have been trying to distract people from that. Of course, they will say that there have been major incidents of terrorism and crime. And I think the whole of Germany, or at least the political establishment, is still trying to come to grips with that.
Okay. Well, let me ask Frank, because I saw you disagree. Yeah, go ahead. I mean, really, if you can also explain, Frank, why East Germans in particular have this image of migrants causing insecurity, causing economic problems for them, when there are actually so many far fewer migrants in their areas overall when compared to Greater Germany. Go ahead.
This is not so true that there is no foreigners or that no refugees have gone there too.
I said far fewer.
They have fewer, but they're still there. But that's not the point. Look at Poland and look at Hungary. These are also former Comecon states under the Soviet regime, and they do not have migration. And this is really a point where they don't have the knife attacks, they don't have the...
And they're also led by far-right governments.
And this is another government, but this is what people see. What's not going to happen, there's no terrorist attacks, there's no knife attacks every day in those countries where there's less migration. And it's not about the Ukraine and the high inflation, because the high inflation was due to the zero interest policy, and which is really the energy problem is also homemade by the green socio-ecologic eco-socialist climate rescue policy, which had to build up in Germany a double base of energy. We got rid of nuclear power, which we do need, like we imported from France. So this is a whole different setting, and the elite or the government or the mainstream media want to put this migration topic and blame the Eastern Germans, but it's a whole German phenomenon that we do not want this as this coalition anymore, because there are a lot of political mistakes in the energy, and in those matters. Migration, we need migration. 1 second, we need migration, selective migration for the labor force and talents. We need talents. But what we do not want, and no other country has this in the world like this, that you can't cross a border without saying who you are, who are not identified. You don't know, nobody knows what you want to do, where you want to work. And this is a problem. And we have scientific proof that the cost of migration, this kind of illegal migration, costs about $2 billion.
Right. That is the anti-migration platform that the AfD has been selling. But let me ask Zafer this, because some are now asking if labeling the AfD as extreme right is actually just a leftist narrative. And they're worried in particular, for example, about a cover of Der Spiegel magazine that showed Björn Höcke, Marine Le Pen, and then Donald Trump in the same style as Hitler was portrayed during the Third Reich. I mean, is there a potential here for this pushing too hard on this be scared of the extreme right actually backfiring against the left?
Well, from the past, we know that stigmatizing and putting on the corner always there is a revenge. On the one hand, the other, it's not only a leftist narrative to blame on AfD or the other parties. There is a firewall between all democratic parties in Germany and the AfD. That's why it is not so easy to come to a coalition now in Thuringin and in Saxony. So at the end of in the mid or long term, they are victims. This is the victim narrative they are feeding. Of course, AfD, others as well, right-wing parties. They are not establishment, but in the meantime, if you look at the performance of the AfD in not only in Germany, not only in East Germany, but also in the Western Germany, look at the European Parliament elections several months ago. So we see a party which becomes more and more an established from a party of establishment in terms of vote share. It's becoming more and more people's party. If you look at the Social Democrats, they have the AfD is performing in Western states in Germany better than the Social Democrats in the Eastern states of Germany. That means we have a situation where AfD is the second largest party in terms of vote share for the time being, and especially during the two elections in Thuringin and Saxony, the BSV, this is the party of Sarah Wagenknecht, which started as a leftist party, has but narratives in terms of migration is more conservative than some liberal parties in Germany. So we have a mixture, and it makes it so hard to form a coalition, a stability. There will be stalemate, etc. All of the things we are facing now, and it is in the meantime also a litmus test.
Yeah, that's what I'd like to talk about going further. Yeah, indeed. James, I saw you raise your eyebrows actually much earlier in Zafer's answer. I'm wondering why. And then, of course, yes, I wanted to move on to whether this will provoke a constitutional crisis. And is it actually a barometer for where the federal election will go?
I actually think Zafer is right there. It will be really tough, increasingly in Germany, to form coalitions that can reach a majority and that include democratic parties that also represent German foreign policy. So the BSW, the Bundesrat Wagenknecht, which is this new breakout force, which I think is really the untold story of these elections. As much as we are talking about the AfD, there are clearly a lot of voters in Eastern Germany who want reduced migration. They are opposed to this sort of Atlanticist foreign policy, but they are not comfortable with the far-right leanings of many within the AfD, particularly in the East. And this is where I'm going to have to disagree with the guest earlier who said the AfD is a centre-right party. I mean, in Thuringia, the State Security Service, the Office for Constitutional Protection, said that they're actually a proven right-wing extremist party. So calling them centre-right, I think, is not completely honest. And I do not think it's really fair to blame the Greens for German inflation when, of course, Germany's entire energy security was built on Russian gas, which, if you missed the news, the big pipeline was blown up underneath the sea. So I don't see how Germany could get that. There are troubling times ahead for the economy, but we have to ask ourselves, why is it when there are troubling times, the German people tend to blame migrants and want to reduce migration when, as the AfD colleague just said, we really need migration in this country because we have a lot of old people. If my figures are right, it's actually 2 workers for every pensioner. That's a huge amount, and it's going to be really tricky to get the raw numbers of specialists as well as manual laborers who come to this country, particularly when the AfD is winning in certain states. This is a risk to what they call the business location of Germany as well.
Yeah, Frank, go ahead.
It's also propaganda by the entrepreneurs and especially from the associations for economy, because they also rely to the CDU and the SPD. Like the Constitution, as you say, the Verfassungsschutz, the protection, our internal CIA forces, to speak, who blames Thuringia and other divisions of the party as right-wing or extremist. This is propaganda because they are in charge for CDU. They want to abolish a political competition. That's all. And that's what people see and understand. And that's why they're not bothered to vote for our party, which they see it's supposed to be right-wing, but who says it's right-wing? It's a proper government. It's not
Well, I mean,
independent.
well, who
But
was the
this
last
is-
leader of the Verfassungsschutz? That was Hans-Georg Maaßen, who's very much a right-wing
He never
figure
said-
who was
He
actually...
never said that. He was restituted. He was taken down from Mrs. Merkel because he never wanted to blame AfD to be this, because he knows it's not. He's
He
sharing
actually gave
actually
tips.
our point
So
of view.
Hans-Georg Maaßen actually gave tips to, sorry if I could finish. Hans-Georg Maaßen actually gave tips to the AfD. The people his security agency was meant to be following and observing because of risks of right-wing extremism. He gave them tips on how to avoid the detection by his own security service. So I think the idea that everyone in the Verfassungsschutz is like a loyal Mueller is actually not true. And there are many AfD sympathizers within the police, within various security services, particularly in Eastern Germany.
Okay.
That's true.
But
Maaßen was replaced because he was not starting this AfD defamation campaign. Who does the actual
Gentlemen,
president of this group?
I'm going to have to interrupt it there. Very unfortunately, we're completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I apologize to Zafer for not being able to give you a final thought moment, but the clock is definitely against us. So I'd like to thank all three of you so much for being with me, and our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.